Hello, and welcome to this overview training on reporting in contentious times, insights on election violence. My name is Rachel Brown. I'm the founder and executive director of Over Zero, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing and increasing societal resilience to identity-based violence and other forms of political violence. I've spent the last decade focused on the intersection between communication and these types of violence, from working on election violence prevention in Kenya to working at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, looking at patterns of dangerous speech around genocides and mass atrocities. Before I go into the training, I want to note that this is a tool for you to be prepared. One of the top pieces of advice throughout is to steer clear of any speculative or alarmist language or narratives. We'll start with an introduction to election violence. What is it, and why does it matter for journalists, members of the media to understand? Election violence is a type of political violence, which can be defined as violence that's aimed at political ends. It's meant in some way to control or change who benefits from and participates fully in a country's political, economic, and socio-cultural life. And because it has these aims, the stories and the narratives that are told around and about violence really matter. In countries that are already vulnerable to political violence, for example, countries that have high levels of societal polarization and division, where politics is seen as a zero-sum winner-takes-all game, where elites have incentives to go outside the process as they compete with each other in factions, where institutions experience low levels of trust and functionality, and there is limited public trust in political processes and institutions. Elections can really emerge as moments of conflict, moments where existing tensions and risk factors boil over into violence and even contestation of election results. Election violence can be defined as any harm or threat of harm, either to any persons or property involved in the election process or to the election process itself during the election period. So let's break that down. This means that electoral violence is really distinguished by its timing. We're specifically talking about violence that happens close to elections. This includes the periods before and after election day. And actually, globally, the majority of this type of violence happens before and after rather than on election day. It's also distinguished by its goals. This is violence that in some way aims to impact the elections, either by changing outcomes or disrupting elections themselves. And so when we look at this trajectory before an election, we often see violence that's meant to intimidate, harass, or target different groups of people to prevent them from showing up to vote. We also often see narratives that start to seed and sow doubt in the process, preemptive declarations of victory or fraud, or threat narratives that really portray the election as zero-sum and start to make claims about what terrible things will happen if the opposition wins. On election day, during the voting period, we can see ongoing violence that's used to intimidate, harass, or threaten people, again, so that they don't show up to vote. And we see these same narratives, right? These early broad calls of fraud, disavowing results, and also these threat narratives that ratchet up the stakes of an election and make it very zero-sum. Another really contentious period is a waiting period, the period of time between when people have cast their votes and when results are announced. Here you can often see mobilizations of different groups, clashes between groups. You can also, prior to an election, see clashes between groups from different parties. And during this waiting period, we can see tensions, but also we especially want to look out for the different narratives, unbased claims from different groups that they've won the election while the vote is being tabulated and counted. And then in the after period, after results of an election have been announced, there can be violence as people dispute the election. So there might be different protests. There might be protests by supporters of different political parties that come into conflict with each other. Opposition protests can sometimes be met with police and state force. With brutality from state forces. And also sometimes there's something called victory violence, where the winner expresses dominance over the perceived loser by targeting specific groups or members of the opposition. So we can see this type of violence in these narratives throughout the election cycle that start to sow doubt in the process, that ratchet up threat, that target different groups to intimidate and harass and determine who shows up to vote, and then ultimately potentially as well to dispute results. It's really important to note throughout all of this that election violence can involve physical violence, but also threats and intimidation. There's a real coercive power of violence. So there doesn't have to actually be physical violence for there to be a threat of violence, or someone showing up armed to a particular location, or vandalism, graffiti, etc., that starts to make people feel unsafe voting or otherwise civically participating. So this is really important to note. Another thing that's important to note is that because we're talking about violence that's aimed at the election process, we can see it aimed at people, at candidates, and not just candidates for higher office, also lower level candidates vying for local positions, et cetera, aimed at voters and often specifically marginalized groups to prevent them from voting, electoral officials, members of different parties at rallies. We can also see violence that's aimed at property, but really specifically at ballots or electoral facilities, violence that aims to impact facilities and property that's part of the process itself. And when we look at societies that are facing some sort of conflict, vulnerabilities to political violence, and how this emerges, whether it's in an election cycle or otherwise, out of a flashpoint, when we look at how this happens, we can see that the key role of media as a shaper of narrative around political violence and as a key actor when it comes to political violence has long been recognized by conflict entrepreneurs, by those who would seek to sow conflict and lead societies towards violence. This was done, perhaps most famously, in recent history in Rwanda with RTLM, a radio station that was actually founded with the purpose of fueling genocidal rhetoric, and which broadcast in the lead up to the genocide and throughout the genocide, encouraging participation, fueling hate-filled narratives, but also threats at people who would refuse to participate in the violence. So really seeking to mobilize participation. We can also see this in the historical example, in historical examples from Bosnia, where print media and radio spread rumors that Bosniak and Croat doctors were injecting Serbs so that they could only have female children and forcing women who were pregnant with male children to have abortions. Here we could see the media knowingly fueling an incorrect rumor that fed into this threat narrative. And again, this is a case where the media knowingly played this role and really was used as a mouthpiece for propaganda. So we've seen media really be misused and knowingly participate in conflict. And I think what's important to draw out of this is that the narratives told by the media, what the media reports, how the media reports it, is recognized as an essential part of any conflict dynamic or conflict in any society. And while these are somewhat extreme examples, the media can also play a more complex and a more nuanced role when it comes to things like election violence. For an example of this, we can look at the Kenyan experience in 2007 and 2008. Following a disputed presidential election, Kenya experienced post-election violence. This violence claimed the lives of over 1,000 people and left hundreds of thousands displaced. In this context, polarized local radio stations, reporting in local mother tongues to specific groups, took sides. They reported in ways that fueled the violence and even encouraged people to participate, to such a degree that actually when International Criminal Court charges were brought against a group of politicians and different actors for crimes against humanity in Kenya's post-election violence, one of the defendants named was a local radio announcer. While some radio stations did this intentionally, or some announcers did this intentionally, others ended up serving as a platform for hate-filled rhetoric that fueled the violence simply by hosting call-in shows and not knowing how to moderate when callers called in and shared messages that were inciting of violence. Still, other local radio stations decided to serve as a platform for peace, calling for an end to the violence and bringing people together. We can also look separately and interdependently at the role of mainstream media. The mainstream media in Kenya did a really excellent job of live coverage throughout this election cycle. There was coverage of the voting process. There was poll monitoring. However, the media wasn't able to transparently report on the counting process due to being blocked. And once the post-election violence began, the media was blocked. There was a live media coverage blackout where the media was no longer allowed to do live broadcasting. Into this void came rumors and mis and disinformation spread over platforms like text messaging across communities. And so we can see the role that the media played in providing transparency throughout the process, there was a really important gap when the media wasn't able to provide transparent information about the counting and when there was the media blackout in the aftermath. As the post-election violence was happening, the media also covered the violence, but at the same time covered calls for peace from different stakeholders and different actions that people were taking to promote peace, and also covered the peace process and the negotiations as they unfolded and ultimately brought an end to the violence. So the ability of the media to walk people through this contentious time was really important. But we can see how the media could play a really harmful role by inadvertently or intentionally broadcasting messages that fueled violence and hatred, or by providing transparency into the process. And so I think the really important thing to take away here, and as we go into thinking about what this means for the US, is that whether it's intentional or not, because the media is so much shaping how people perceive and understand events and their meaning and what their causes are and what's going on around them, the media will influence conflict dynamics, no matter what it does. And so being aware of the ways that the media can influence conflict dynamics and some of the extra care that needs to be taken when reporting in a really contentious time is really critical. And so we'll move now to really start to consider what this means in the United States. And I want to start by just giving a really broad summary of some of the critical risk factors that we face in the US and some of what we're seeing now that means that this type of care and awareness from the media is so essential and so important. First of all, the United States has several underlying vulnerabilities to political violence. And the different risk indicators and scores that are done internationally to look at early indicators and risks for violence, the US still scores very well, right? We're still seen as quite resilient to violence. However, on several key factors, we've really seen a drastic decline in the last several years. One of these is polarization and factionalization. So we're seeing a deeply divided country with sort of zero-sum narratives and rhetoric. We've also seen what we would call dangerous or hate rhetoric emerging as part of our political discourse. This type of rhetoric paints different groups as a threat, justifies and valorizes violence or harms targeting different groups of people, uses dehumanizing language, etc. So we've seen this become part of our political discourse at the highest levels. We also see declining trust in institutions, and we see politicization of trust of institutions. We've seen increased political violence with hate crimes from El Paso to Tree of Life, again, often making reference to the type of dangerous rhetoric that we're seeing as part of our political discourse. We've also seen politically motivated shootings, even assassination attempts with the congressional baseball game, as well as the mailing of pipe bombs to several key figures. And recently, we've seen vigilante violence in the face of protests against police brutality. We saw a shooter in Kenosha be valorized and defended for murder. And so this type of vigilante violence, where violence is portrayed as violence by civilians, illegal violence is portrayed as being part of maintaining law and order, is really dangerous. Also, in the wake of COVID-19, we've seen a level of economic volatility that really wasn't a risk indicator for us prior. So one of the risk indicators we'd look at internationally is a massive economic downturn. And so the economic volatility that the US is experiencing potentially increases this sort of underlying vulnerability to political violence writ large. Then we can look at some proximate indicators and concerning signs around elections that we would look at elsewhere. So we tend to be concerned when we see zero-sum rhetoric around an election. Narratives that say if they win, everything will be destroyed, and that really portray this as a winner-takes-all contest. Preemptive declarations of fraud or victory start to undermine and attempt to delegitimize the process, are also really concerning. And existing levels of political violence during the process. We looked at that pre-election violence, right? So we've already seen some of that, and we've seen it in the form as well of state violence against peaceful protesters, right? So anything that starts to shut down civic space and people's ability to freely and peacefully express their grievances is of real concern in proximity to an election. And then finally, we have this extra layer of challenge, which is that there are large procedural changes necessitated by COVID. These these build on resources and experience that the United States already has with mail-in voting, which we've of course had for a very long time. But a lot of these changes have already been politicized in the rhetoric. And there will be technical challenges of administering an election during a pandemic. So really looking at how those are being met and helping build confidence can be really critical. And we'll have a waiting period. Vote tallying and tallying the count and announcing results will take longer than people in the United States have become used to. And so really managing that waiting period and the potential preemptive declarations of victory or fraud that could emerge during that become very important. As with any country or context, it's also important to look at history, whether there's a history of violence and what that looks like. And the United States does have a long history of election violence. Historically, much of this violence has been aimed at keeping marginalized groups disenfranchised, whether it's preventing voter registration, preventing voting on voting day, or contesting election results. And this ranges from the years after the Civil War, the decades following the Civil War, when violence was systematically employed across the country to prevent formerly enslaved Black communities from participating in the political process, through the Civil Rights Movement, where, for example, during Bloody Sunday, civil rights activists marching for voting rights were brutally attacked by state forces. And so these are just a couple of examples, and there are, of course, many, but it's important to think about the type of election violence that we've experienced as a country in the past as we look at what we're experiencing right now. So given this context in the United States, where we're going into this election cycle with several really important risk factors and challenges at play, the media really has an essential role to play. And especially when we look at some of those international examples, both the extremes of how media has played an active and harmful role, but also the complexities and challenges for media navigating landscapes and societies that are characterized with these levels of division, politicized and polarizing narratives around elections themselves, procedural changes, dangerous rhetoric coming from politicians. How do you report on that without becoming a mouthpiece? There are a lot of really critical considerations. And in this context, with a level of awareness and education on these themes, the media can really serve as an important voice, guiding people in a high-risk time with clear and accurate information, or without knowledge and sort of self-awareness of what it means to be active and potentially used in this context, the media can inadvertently add fuel to the fire and really fan the flames. And so that's what we're going to turn to now. We're going to go through with a few core goals in mind, some key priorities. So the core goals are really to be this helpful voice, guiding people through a somewhat confusing and contentious time, by providing clear and accurate information in real time and proactively helping set expectations so people know what they're seeing and what to expect. Helping people navigate and make sense of what's going on around them as things feel confusing and in the realm of there's a lot of different information going around, and help highlight clear paths forward for people so that they can see ways that they can engage and make decisions in this time. The goal here is also to prevent unintended harm, to really understand and avoid the risks for adding fuel to the fire. And so in this introductory session, we'll go through 3 key priorities to understand how the media can inadvertently add fuel to the fire, but also what are some core best practices, not just things to avoid, but what can be done proactively. So we'll talk about this sense of confusion in the face of things like procedural changes and how the media can really offer clarity, cutting through noise, especially when these issues have become so contentious. We'll talk about inflammatory rhetoric. What do those patterns look like to be able to recognize them, what to avoid, and how to move away from fueling dehumanization and incitement and towards showcasing humanity. And we'll talk about shifting norms, the way that acts of violence and the way that they're reported can shift perceived norms in a society, and how to do careful framing and reporting, especially in the midst of violence itself. So we'll start by talking about how we move from confusion to clarity. What are the risks here? What are the different things that we're seeing in the US landscape that create a risk for confusion? First of all, we have these procedural changes, an increased mail-in voting, more early voting available in different states. We have the potential for long lines on election day with social distancing requirements, slower voting, new and different polling locations, etc. All these procedural changes that have been incredibly made with such a short time frame to be able to have an election during COVID-19 also open up to risks of challenges on election day and politicization of these very procedures themselves, as we've already seen. There are also technical challenges to doing this, right? Inadequate staffing, machine glitches or malfunctions, things like that, that are really just basic technical challenges, but in a politicized environment can be used to fuel narratives about fraud or undermining legitimacy of the election. The process for counting and results announcement. We talked about how this waiting period is often a time where tensions rise. And because this waiting period for results announcement is going to look and feel really differently than it has in recent years past, again, this opens up the space for preemptive declarations of victory or fraud and for tensions to really mount. And so managing that particular part of the process and thinking through it in advance is important. A general climate of fear and uncertainty, because we're seeing violence already, because there's a lot of different narratives and mis and disinformation going around. This is a risk, something that places the US at a little bit of a higher risk. Violence and the reporting of violence. So we have, as I mentioned before, already seen instances of political violence throughout this election cycle, and how it's reported also matters. Whether it's we'll get into this a little bit later, but whether certain groups are cast as more dangerous and how this violence gets reported is really important. So understanding how the media can fuel these risks is really important for understanding what to avoid. So these are sort of traps to avoid falling into. First of all, speculation and sensationalism, which can be really tempting, but where there are already a lot of changes and where things can be confusing and when there's a lot of countering claims and speculation about the election itself, it's really important to avoid this in the narratives that go out publicly. So avoid speculating on what's going to happen, even as we talk about these risks to be aware of and to navigate, avoiding speculating about risks of violence, avoiding speculation about too much speculation about who will win, especially after votes have been cast, and then sensationalism. This can be really tempting when there's confusion, when there are some sort of changes to the processes, when politicians are making different claims and conflicting claims, and when there's tension. Avoiding sensationalizing that can be really important because it can, again, really fuel a sense of chaos and confusion amongst the general public. Repeating unfounded and broad claims of fraud and victory that might emerge throughout the electoral process. So especially as different politicians and candidates start making these claims, simply repeating them without any context can really make things worse. Reporting challenges to the election process. This is really important part, obviously, of having transparency and the media's role in bringing transparency about the process to the public. But reporting broad challenges without getting specific or providing context around them can fuel this broader sense of confusion. Providing confusing information or presenting information about changes or processes in a way that's confusing can also add to this broader sense. Decontextualized reports of violence that just talk broadly about violence without really getting specific into details can also feed this sense of, again, broader chaos and confusion. So these are things to avoid. What really can be done to help bring clarity into this process? The first really important role that the media can play is really around setting expectations. So proactive civic education information, preparing people for the waiting period and the counting process, not in sensationalist or speculative terms, but simply really talking about, this is how we've made it possible to vote during COVID-19. These are the measures that have been taken. This is what voting will look like. This is what to expect. We'll be keeping you updated in these particular ways throughout the waiting period as we wait for the vote to be counted. So really calmly and clearly helping people understand what to expect. There's a lot of mis and disinformation out there, including mis and disinformation targeting people to prevent them from voting or voting accurately. Keeping abreast of this information, of different efforts to track and monitor online mis and disinformation campaigns, for example, can be really important so you don't accidentally repeat any mis or disinformation, but also as you see the types of rumors and disinformation that are out there, to be able to proactively provide information, the correct information on those same themes and really educate the public. This educational expectation setting role is really, really critical. Also, be prepared to report on challenges and grievances that might emerge, and as well as the processes and the procedures for addressing them. So not just reporting on broad challenges or broad grievances, but really getting specific about the challenges, the grievances that are arising, what exactly is going on, reporting with a degree of specificity, fact-checking around that, and then also reporting on the different processes and procedures that are available to address those challenges, grievances, or any issues with processes or procedures. A really good example of how we can of this has to do with the 2013 Kenyan election. So in 2013, Kenya voted under a new constitution. This new constitution changed the number of people that people were voting for. It changed the balloting process. There were 6 different ballots that people had to vote with. There was an incredibly high voter turnout. This is just one picture of the lines outside of polling stations. People were so excited to vote. This required so much civic education, and media platforms became a really important place to be providing Kenyans with information about what the election process would look like and what to expect with all of these different changes. After the election, the results were contested, but this time there were really clear processes in place for how to contest an election result. And so in 2013, when the opposition candidate pictured here, Raila Odinga, announced that he would be making a petition to the courts to contest the election results, the media followed that entire process, including broadcasting the procedures and providing, again, a set of transparency into this dispute resolution, as well as the voting process itself. Also, knowing that we're already seeing unfounded and preemptive claims of fraud, of victory, it's really important to be prepared to frame and debunk these claims so as not to fuel rumors. So not to simply repeat any of these types of claims, but instead be ready to talk about how people are making different claims, but what the process actually looks like and what we do and don't know at a particular moment. Have the facts. This is really important, especially, given how state-by-state elections are in this country. Get educated in advance to understand what the specific election processes, procedures look like, and what different processes for dispute resolution look like in the aftermath of the election. And also have the best practices for correcting misinformation at hand. We won't go into it too much in this presentation, but things like not repeating misinformation, using positive framing. So really being prepared to report on mis and disinformation, and also being prepared with the facts as events unfold. It's also important, because things are moving at a fast pace, to have systems in place to be able to verify information quickly. We'll get to this later, but this can mean having certain types of experts on speed dial. One really interesting example of how this worked was Indonesia throughout the 2019 election cycle. And in this example, this network, Check was created of journalists from more than 20 of the top news outlets in the country. And they actually worked together to proactively identify mis and disinformation across different platforms, from WhatsApp to Facebook. And then as they identified different mis and disinformation, to work to provide accurate content. So this is an example of proactive collaboration, even across different news outlets, between journalists to understand the landscape into which they were reporting. What was all the inaccurate misinformation that was out there that people were consuming, and how could they then tailor accurate, fact-based information to the general public? It's also really important, we talked about the risk within that waiting period, to be prepared for coverage during the waiting period, right? We know that there's going to be some sort of waiting period. Getting educated in advance about what that looks like and how to report as that unfolds. So for example, we talked about being prepared for preemptive declarations of victory or other statements from politicians. Be ready to contextualize that within the broader counting process. Be ready to explain to people what's going on, how the counting process operates, and also to help them be patient as we wait to have actual results rather than speculating. And this goes to everything that we just talked about. But in addition to being ready with best practices on your own as you're reporting on these potential inflammatory and false statements from different leaders or groups of people, it's really important to think in advance and even work together with your newsroom or your colleagues about what are our guidelines. How are we going to handle it if these types of statements are made? And thinking in advance about how to report that can make it really easy, much easier in the moment. And then finally, where there are instances of violence, we'll get to this a little bit more in the later categories, but it is really important, so I'll repeat it here to start with, to contextualize and be really specific with reporting on violence, rather than just to report on violence broadly and in really broad terms. And again, because I can't say this enough, I really want to emphasize that while it's so tempting, avoiding speculation and sensationalist language is so important. And around the world where countries face this type of election violence, different media groups will create even codes of conduct throughout an election cycle. And often this includes not preemptively declaring results and things like that. And I think it's really important to remember how much speculation and sensationalist language around different events can actually help ratchet up tensions, contribute to this atmosphere of confusion, and become in some ways self-fulfilling prophecies. So that's a real responsibility that, again, I just can't emphasize enough. So the next priority area is moving from inflammatory rhetoric towards showcasing humanity. So let's talk about the risks here. There are certain patterns of inflammatory rhetoric that we see appear over and over again. These include portraying entire groups of people as guilty, often scapegoating, especially minority groups, for things like economic downturns and diseases. The second is portraying groups as a threat. This is a construction of threat where an entire group, again, this is often done targeting minority groups, are portrayed as some sort of threat. Common tropes here include lines like, they're coming to get us. There are often threats of sexual violence. They'll rape our women and they'll hurt our children. There are lines like, they'll take our jobs, destroy our culture, our language, etc. This type of othering narrative is really common in the ratcheting up of tensions and mobilizing people to commit harms or violence against a group. We also can see threat narratives between political parties and opposition in election periods. If they win, this is what they'll do to us, to the country, etc. Third, here we have dehumanizing language, dehumanization. This is portraying people as less than or not fully human in some way. This is done most overtly with comparisons of people to animals, to pests, and to rodents. But it can be done in more covert ways as well. Things like word choice. We see this a lot with immigration. Language like, there are swarms of people coming across the border. This, of course, we wouldn't use the word swarms to talk about people in general. And then any sort of calls for violence. This type of incitement can be very overt calls for violence or more coded dog whistles that portray violence as necessary, as good, and start to celebrate acts of violence and mobilize people towards violence. We can also get zero-sum identity narratives. Narratives, again, in political contestation that really portray it as a winner-takes-all game. So narratives that say, if they win, here's what they're going to do, here's what we'll really lose. And also we see this entrenching of certain elements of identity. So really talking about people only in terms of a conflict identity, whether that's a political party, race, ethnicity, religion, rather than portraying the sort of multiple aspects and facets of their identity. Are they a mother, a father? Are they a fan of a particular sports team from a particular area? And media can fuel these risks inadvertently through reporting. It's often when this type of language and rhetoric is out there, it can become easy to be used as a platform. So especially when it's politicians, when it's leaders, when it's public figures using these inflammatory messages, repeating the messages in a headline, simply quoting them in an article without context, without contextualizing them, without debunking misinformation that they contain, without providing alternative information, can be really dangerous. And it also can become easy to fall into the trap of feeding into these frames with reporting, when that's a lot of the narrative and the rhetoric that's out there from public figures, or when it's prominent in some way in public discourse. Reporting can be done in ways that increase notions of threat in the way that they portray different groups of this sort of zero-sum competition. So it's really important to think about whether the frames you're using as you're reporting could feed these narratives. Reporting can also use dehumanizing metaphors, framing, and phrasing. This is what I just discussed in that example of talking about swarms of people. Again, even things like verb choice, the metaphors that we use in describing different groups, different types of actions, can be dehumanizing. And so it's really important to have this awareness of language. Uneven reporting on violence. And this can be portraying groups differently, portraying violence differently depending on who it's committed by. And this can contribute to portrayals of certain groups as criminal or inherently violent. So what does it look like to move from becoming a platform for some of these narratives to instead really showcasing shared humanity and finding that in the stories and in the narratives that are portrayed? So the first thing is really something to avoid, right? Don't simply repeat these narratives. It's really important to be aware of this in reporting, but also have policies in place. When we know that this type of rhetoric is out there and could be reported on, what are the policies about if and how and when to report on it so as not to just repeat it? Be ready to fact check when dealing with these types of narratives and to frame and report without sort of just becoming a mouthpiece or a platform through which different actors know that they can get their message out there. Being really, really careful with language. Avoid dehumanizing language, metaphors, and framing like we just talked about. Avoid framing an entire group of people as a threat, as guilty. This is really an important place to take care. It's also important to report with an awareness of how inherent implicit biases and things like that might lead us to portray different groups and actions differently, as well as sort of patterns in historic reporting and narratives about different groups. Think about words like chaos, unrest, violence in the street, riots. Are there certain groups that tend to be portrayed using these terms more than others? We can think about how we portray, for example, armed protests at the Michigan State Legislature. How were they discussed and talked about versus mostly peaceful protests and property destruction? So looking at the type of language and words that are used to describe different groups is really important, and to look at where there is an inequality and an unevenness there. It can also be really important when there is violence to contextualize the violence and its underlying dynamics, not just to report on violence in a vacuum. What are the dynamics? What are the different causes? If it's violence that happens at a protest, what are the underlying reasons why people are there? Can you contextualize the violence within the space of the broader protest that was there? If there is an attack where the shooter is repeating white supremacist ideology, can you contextualize it in relation to that issue and the dynamics of white supremacy in this country? If it's a militia group, can you discuss it within the dynamics of an organized armed group, right? So contextualizing, placing the violence in context, looking at its underlying causes, dynamics, and also short and long-term impacts and consequences, and being really clear about those. Report on individuals and groups with intention. And this is really important because collective blame is where we blame an entire group of people for the actions of one or a few members of a group. And so it's really important when there is violence or actions that are taken by one or a couple of people that they're reported on as such, rather than reported on as this group did this. Avoid victimizing language. So when people are targeted with violence, ensure that you're showing their full humanity and bringing up stories that show their full humanity rather than simply portraying people only as victims. And then throughout reporting, showcasing multiple identities and multiple perspectives that people hold can be really important to add a sense of nuance and undermine that zero-sum narrative that's in place. A really important tip here, especially given the information environment that we're operating in right now, is to get familiar with existing tropes. What are conspiracy theories that are out there? What are the ideologies that are out there and ideas that are promoting violence? And get familiar so that you don't inadvertently feed into them. A lot of groups that are out there trying to stoke violence or harm really, again, look to the media to fuel their aims and as a vehicle for their aims. And a really interesting example of this is 1930s Germany, where Nazi-aligned brown shirts would go into left-leaning areas, and they would proactively really pick fights with communists and social democrats. And then they would use those fights to frame up and justify a need for law and order. And the media often would repeat this framing. So they would report using the framings that were offered by these groups. And they had really created the story intentionally. So it's really important just to know what types of ideas, conspiracies, and agendas are out there, because even reporting events that are true, without understanding those broader frames, you can end up feeding into really intentional narratives. The third area that we'll dive into is around shifting norms and careful framing. Reporting and narratives and stories are really important for shaping what people see as normal, what people think that all or most people are doing or approve or disapprove of. And it turns out that those perceptions of norms shape our behavior more than almost anything else. And when it comes to conflict, violence is often used to shape norms. This type of dangerous narratives that we just talked about, inflammatory rhetoric, is used to help ensure that people feel that violence is accepted, and to really shift those perceptions of what's normal and what's supported in pretty harmful directions. And so reporting can either really give violence a platform for recruitment to normalize this type of rhetoric and threat-based ideas. And it can also be used as a platform for violence to gain more traction, for violence to really serve to intimidate different groups. And so it's important to understand how that works and then be really careful in framing and response. So the risks here are that different acts of violence and different events start to portray violence or the acceptance of violence as normal, as the norm in society. This can also feed a sense of chaos. Also, a perceived broad acceptance of othering, exclusion, or the targeting of different groups. And perceptions of division and zero-sum mentality as being the dominant and really only framework for people to operate in. Again, violence can also serve to create expectations for participation, to intimidate, to harass. And so acts of violence are often used to signal or to send a message, for example, that people shouldn't feel safe exercising their civic duties and rights and participating civically. And the media can fuel these risks in reporting on violence without being, if it's not careful, by making violence seem more prevalent or supported than it is through the way that stories are framed and reported. Through dehumanizing people targeted by violence, by really only showing them as victims, showing them without agency, through providing a platform where violent acts, violent narratives, and actors can come to be normalized, but also to really increase their notoriety and their platform and serve to intimidate. So how do we, in this context of shifting norms and potentially reporting on conflict and the type of rhetoric that we're seeing, be really careful in our framing so as not to fuel it? The sort of core guiding principle here is to really be able to draw attention to issues of concern, not to ignore them, but also at the same time not to portray them as the norm. So framing is really important here. Instead of saying hate is everywhere and hate crimes are on the rise, talking about how many people are standing up against hate crimes, what communities are doing in response, and how many people actually disapprove of that, while also drawing attention to the fact that this is a problem that needs to be dealt with, right? And so when we see violence, it's really important to frame, to be specific about what we're seeing, and also include additional information to contextualize events. So there might be one instance of violence, but how many people showed up at whatever the event or incident was that were peaceful? How many other people in the community are taking actions across different conflict lines to address the underlying issues? How many people don't actually support what they saw? So providing the context in the community around what's being seen. Also getting really specific. So reporting just broadly, there's a breakout of violence. Violence erupts in this city. Instead, being really specific about what's happening and where it's happening and really localizing the events. A really good example of this being done is an approach by an organization called Search for Common Ground, which works in media and conflict areas around the world. They have a model of media synergy where they help journalists from different newsrooms collaborate with each other to be able to leverage their collective resources to really get on the ground and be able to report on specific locations and specific incidents with a level of specificity and really firsthand in a way that individual newsrooms might not have the resources and capacity to do. And this was really successful For example, in 2005 in Burundi, there was an incident of violence in one location around the election. And soon after it was reported, there started to be rumors that a civil war was back on, that violence was spiraling out of control. But because this media synergy, this group had correspondents on the ground, they were able to report in real time, to interview local actors and really contextualize exactly what happened, instead of becoming sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of reporting on this broad sense of violence that could have indeed, because of these threat narratives, started to feed itself. It's also really important when there are acts of violence, it can serve to emphasize certain divisions along various conflict lines in a society. Be sure to tell stories that activate and demonstrate, we talked about this before, cross-cutting identities, stakeholders from different groups maintaining positive norms. Who are local voices? What are local actions and leaders doing? Are there interfaith networks taking action? Are there local coalitions that are working on underlying issues and working across different divisions as well? So showcasing these different identities, these different groups that are working in different ways, rather than just framing and discussing along conflict lines. It's also really important to provide a range of perspectives and to ensure that included in the reporting are perspectives from people who are being targeted with rhetoric or violence. What are they doing about it? What are leaders from those communities asking for? What are they doing to support their own communities? This is really, really important. And in consultation and with permission, in the wake of violence and intimidation, as long as it's safe and secure to do so, show efforts that are being taken by, in partnership with, or in support of affected communities to maintain safety and address violence. If there's violence at a polling station, that might be important to report, but it's also important to report what's being done to maintain safety, who's showing up to help make sure that everyone can vote safely. And that can be really helpful so that violence doesn't get a platform to really intimidate people, to discourage them from participating in this process. And then it's important to be really, really careful when reporting on violence, violent actors and their words. Avoid repeating word for word their inflammatory narratives. Show condemnation of the actions and positive actions that people are taking as well. Stories of people who were victims that, like we talked about before, showcase their full humanity, rather than making a shooter the star of a story and increasing their notoriety, for example. It's really important to note that you can be as careful as absolutely possible with the content of a story. No matter what's inside, the headlines and the visual content around a story matter. People have short attention spans. They might be glancing through. The headlines, pictures, visuals will stick with people. And so it's really important to make sure that not only the content of a story, but the headlines and the visual content that goes along with it are clear, are accurate, and are in line with the different principles that we've discussed. People have short attention spans, and there will be a lot of noise. This is what we talked about in that confusion piece. We really want to make sure that as people pay attention to these headlines, take in the snippets, and take in the imagery, that these are things that are done well. There's a great example of this looking at US history of where this went wrong and where a movement was able to do some work to help correct it. At the turn of the century, when newspapers reported on lynchings, even newspapers where the entire body of an article denounced lynchings that took place, they often repeated the inflammatory language and accusations that were used to justify a lynching in the first place in the headlines, often including really explicit and inflammatory language around sexual violence. And these headlines repeated inaccurate information and accusations. They served to mobilize people and justify lynch mobs, even though the content of articles was denouncing lynchings themselves. And so groups within the anti-lynching movement actually worked with newspapers to change headlines and imagery around this reporting. And so I think that's a really important case study to think about in US history. Another important element to pay attention to is sourcing preparation. Given what we know about the dynamics of risk and the types of things that we might be concerned about, what pre-work can help you consider the sourcing that you'll need in order to report amidst these risks and these potential events so that you can have sources and connections lined up in advance. So for example, are there certain communities that we know are likely to be targeted with violence? We talked early on about the history in this country of the targeting of different minority groups with violence around elections. So do you have connections to leaders from these communities that have been historically marginalized and targeted? Black, Muslim, Arab, Sikh, South Asian, immigrant communities, for example. Do you have sources within other communities that you think might be targeted in the areas where you're reporting? Making sure you have connections to leaders from those communities can be really helpful to do proactive reporting and also be able to reach out to people as things unfold. Are there certain types of events or places where violence might occur? Things like rallies, protests? And do you have connections to leaders or people with insights about these types of places or events who can provide you with knowledge? How can you be sure that your reporting reflects the diversity of views, the diversity of experiences within the affected community, rather than just the person, for example, committing violence, who might be very out there with their narrative and their perspective? So in addition to people targeted and affected with violence, do you have connections to leaders in general from different segments of a community? Community leaders, faith leaders, business owners, local officials, and understanding their narratives can be really helpful in that normative piece we talked about. And then there's expertise, going all the way back to that question around confusion. What types of expertise will you want to have on speed dial as events unfold? For example, do you want experts on election procedures, like including processes for contesting or challenging results or processes that have taken place? Experts on civil and human rights, history, organization, from the legal perspective, on violence and violence prevention. Think about what type of expertise and experts you might want to have a list of in order to reach out to. And then finally, because a lot of this is done by individual reporters, but a lot of the things like headlines and more broadly, what will get published or not is also has to do with the publication at large. And so given that some of these things, like reporting on false statements, preemptive declarations of victory, inflammatory rhetoric, violence itself, consider whether additional editorial guidelines could be useful, and whether you want to set out some guidelines at this point in the process so that you're not making individual decisions and calls anew every single time that something comes up, but you have sort of an agreed upon set of guidelines with your team. Thank you so much. We're excited to keep providing additional information as it's requested, and thank you for your time.